In the Buddha, his teaching, and the fellowship most excellent, we take our refuge until enlightenment. By the merit of generosity and other transcendent virtues, may we attain Buddhahood for the sake of all that lives. May the merits of these teachings benefit all beings. May these words help and not harm. May they clarify and not confuse. May they self-liberate, leaving no trace behind. Picture a stormy night. The smell of rain, the peal of thunder. An old woman is alone in her sitting room, which is dimly lit and filled from floor to ceiling with photographs. There's a wood stove and a fire crackling in it, 2 bowls next to it for the dog's kibble, for the cat's milk. One of the lamps in the corner flickers, deepening the shadows on the gramophone's humongous horn. It's gold, like the rug and the old reading chair the woman is sitting in, knitting, her needles faintly clicking. And across from the old woman, whose face is made of paper mache, lies an old dog, made entirely of yarn. And he sighs now and then, or raises his head at the thunder. And if you look closely, you see that all the photographs on the walls are of the woman and this dog, whose name is Jackson. Photos from pup to old hound, young woman to old crone. They're playing frisbee, they're going on a picnic, they're canoeing on a lake, looking adoringly at one another. And then there's 2 cats that pass by, an old female tom and her white kitten. They walk across the room, and Jackson kind of growls at them under his breath. The woman puts a record on the gramophone, and autumn leaves fills the room. And as the piano plays, she sings softly to herself. And at one point, Jackson joins in, howling in tune. And then there's a knock on the door. Jackson looks up. He looks at the old woman, who just keeps on knitting. There's a crack of thunder, and now there's pounding on the door. And the rain starts to come down harder. And Jackson growls more loudly now, and the old woman, realizing there's somebody at the door, hobbles over to open it. It's a bright yellow door, the brightest thing in the house. And when it's opened, framed in it is the grim Reaper, all dry bones and gray rags, a staff in his hand and a hood covering his skull. Jackson growls harder. He lets out a bark, and the woman just shushes him, pointing to the guest. She can't see well, so she confuses Death with a young Girl Scout. And she invites her into tea, figuring she must be freezing in the pouring rain. And Death, a little surprised, follows her in and sits down at the kitchen table. And he has tea and the madeleines the woman offers him, while Jackson undoes himself, trying to get rid of the unwelcome guest. The protective hound all the way to the end. And first he grabs a corner of Death's robe in his mouth, and he pulls him back. And again, the woman yells at him in a very soft French accent to stop. Then he runs over to the other room, grabs his leash, and comes back to the kitchen, whining to be taken out. And the woman says, "You just went out." And she's not taken in. So he decides he needs a distraction. He sees the cat go into the bedroom, and so he follows her. The door closes behind them, and all hell breaks loose. There's glass breaking, there's a lamp falls over, the cat's meowing, excuse me, sounds of a scuffle. And when the door opens again, Jackson slinks out, his tail between his legs, and the cat just sits there licking his paws. And then Jackson brings the kitten to death as an offering. Well, don't take her. Why don't you take this tiny kitten with eyes as big as his head? And Death takes the young cat, very, very gingerly, and he sets it on the table next to him, and then he gently strokes him with his bony hand. And so, knowing it's his last chance, Jackson just attacks Death directly. He knocks him off the chair, grabs his staff. He's not going to let go. And one more time, the woman scolds him, and this time shuts him out of the room. And Jackson sits outside the kitchen, just looking up at the doorknob, crying, pawing the door. And after a moment or two, he gives up. He goes to his bed, he lies down. But first, he knocks down one of the photos, and then he kind of cradles it in his paws. And a moment later, the door opens. And Jackson just dashes into the kitchen. He looks around for a brief moment. He doesn't see her. He doesn't see his owner. And you think, that's it. She's gone. And then there she is, just crossing the kitchen. She goes over to the sink, washes the teacups. And Jackson looks at her, and he looks at Death, confused. And Death just looks back at him. And then Death hunches down, and he whispers something only Jackson hears. And he goes, and Jackson looks into the kitchen, and he howls once, very softly. The woman doesn't hear him. So she doesn't see Jackson follow Death out the door. And as they're walking down the lane side by side, the rain stops and the sun comes out from behind the clouds. And for a moment, Death's robe glistens with rainbows. Jackson stops to look back at the house. And Death takes a bone from his pocket and he throws it. And Jackson bounds after it to the sound of autumn leaves. It's late fall now, almost beginning of winter. And of course, this is a time when death and dying are more apparent, although death is inseparable from life, always. The story I described is from a short, an animated short called Death and the Lady. And if you haven't seen it, please do. It is beautiful. It's on the New Yorker's website. And it got me thinking about death. Of course, life's one certainty. Its ineluctable end. But I was thinking also that is in great part what got us all here. I mean, perhaps not directly, perhaps not consciously. But think how different life would be if we did not die. How would we live if we could live forever? Death was one of the 4 signs or sights that the Buddha saw when he left the palace with old age, sickness, death, and then he saw a mendicant, he saw a wanderer. These were signs he couldn't ignore, he couldn't forget, and eventually he had to do something about them. I mean, there's something we all have to do something about, sooner or later. And I think, generally speaking, we would rather not. Not anytime soon, and preferably ever. But then what happens is we're surprised, offended by sickness, old age, and death, the surging waves. If you remember that prayer that Lama Yeshe and Lama Zopa have shared with us. May I liberate all beings from the ocean of existence with its surging waves of birth, aging, illness, and death. We get surprised, we get offended by these waves. Like a man who was in a retirement home and he said, I was a good father, I was a good husband. I worked hard all my life. I exercised, I climbed mountains. Why am I here? As if someone had broken the contract. That Google owns a company called Calico, who's trying to solve the problem of death. But death isn't a problem to be solved. Neither is life. And yet it's not easy to live or die, or it's not easy to live or die well. And it is not easy to lose something or someone. If you've gone through it, you know how interminable the days suddenly feel. It's hard to enjoy things that before delighted you. You look around and you wonder, how in the world are people just living, just going about their lives, their business, having breakfast, talking about the latest political circus, going for walks. And maybe you tell yourself, it's not so bad. It's not so bad, just get over it. I mean, people are suffering on the other side of the world. Why are you still struggling with this? But for a while, no matter what you tell yourself, it's you can't quite feel yourself. It's like you have cling wrap wrapped around you. And so there's this veil, there's this layer between you and the world. And so loss in any form is hard. The loss of our vitality, our passion, our mobility, our acuity, our sharpness, the loss of people we love, places we know, things that break, we get lost. But what's harder? To live as if we get to keep these, to live as if what we have we'll always have. That's much, much harder because it's not true, because it's not the way things are. And one helpful thing to keep in mind is that what we still have is never less than what we lack. If we could keep that equation in mind, then we'd be well on our way to freedom, or at the very least, to acceptance, which is a form of freedom. In some ways, Buddhism is a tradition that aims to help us become comfortable with losing everything. Tibetan Buddhists just say it plainly. When it comes to life and death, all of practice is to prepare us for dying. Which in a way is saying all of practice is to prepare us for living. I have a friend whose 8-year-old said to her many years ago, "Isn't it true, Mom, that the moment we're born, we start dying?" And I thought to myself, I hope you don't forget this. I hope you don't forget, having asked this question, having seen this truth. Because in a way, this is the best part of life. Maybe a little bit of an upside down way, but the fact that we die on a par with our living. I mean, this is what makes life so flush with itself, so imperative. And because we die as we live, in each and every moment, and at the last moment, that means that we can die and live with grace, with presence, with infinite gratitude and appreciation. I mean, we think to ourselves, oh, wouldn't it be wonderful to just live on and on, as Woody Allen said. But is that really true? Would it? Would it be so good to live on and on? Or would you choose death with your living, loss with your finding, because that is what gives life its preciousness, its edge? I mean, I know I would rather risk losing and being hurt than the illusion of always having. I was reading the story of a woman who essentially finds the love of her life as her father is dying. She can't imagine such loss. She's very close to him. She can't imagine the world without him. And in that perhaps most difficult time in her life, she finds something so vast that she also could not ever have imagined. And she thinks, I have to mark this. I have to make this more permanent. So I'll ask her to marry me. And the first opportunity is at her father's bedside, because they think so that he can be there, so that he can share in such joy. But she thinks, I can't mix that much joy with that much sorrow. The second chance comes when they're both sick. The two women are in bed. Their sheets are just sodden with sweat. Their eyes are crusted over. They're two big balls of mucus, basically. And she thinks to herself, in sickness and in health, yes, this is how it is. And decides, this is it. This is the time to ask. And then she looks around and she thinks, anything short of a trip to the landfill would be more romantic. A more romantic setting for the proposal. So with difficulty, she holds her tongue. And then the third chance comes, they're laying down the flooring of their house. A run-of-the-mill day and a run-of-the-mill week. And she thinks, today. And then she's about to ask, and her partner shares with her a sermon that she was helping officiate once, and it was Ash Wednesday. And a young girl, goes up to the altar and realizes very late what day it is and what it means. And as she's about to get that sign of the cross on her forehead, she just hollers at the top of her lungs, "I don't want to die." And they both laugh. And then she proposes. And they marry, confirming that they'll go on living and dying together. So this is what I think. That we do live as we die, and we die as we live. That these things happen simultaneously is not the right word. Interdependently. And so that to live dying is to live knowing this isn't forever. Right? And just pause that for a moment and really take that in. This isn't forever. Because I think we have an uncannily strong built-in mechanism that protects us from really knowing that. I suppose it's our survival instinct. But I do remind myself of this. I try to, as I'm scrolling through Instagram, and I think, if this was my last hour, is this how I would spend it? And yet it is hard to take in that I won't be here always. It is very difficult to accept. It's difficult to accept that what I have now, I will not always have. Not in this way, and one day, not at all. In one sense, life is a continuous series of losses. I was about to say, unless you get rid of that way of seeing, of losing and gaining altogether. But it's not even unless, that's true whether you see it that way or not. Because what does that loss really entail? Where there is no place where we are not. I shared this earlier in the newsletter. I am life entire, which is not struck from stones, nor budded from branches, but all that is rooted in me. And since all vitality blazes forth from me, I also serve. And I am life eternally the same, without beginning or end. Hildegard of Bingen. This is from the Book of Divine Works. And that life eternally the same is neither eternal nor the same. But I think she knows that. It's more without beginning or end. In Buddhism, we say it's beginningless and endless, or birthless and deathless. I am life entire without beginning or end, therefore I am death entire. without beginning or end. Master Dogen says in Genja Koan, life is a period unto itself, death is a period unto itself. Life does not become death. How can that be? Hildegard is saying, I neither am nor am not. You see? To be or not to be, that is not the question, said Thich Nhat Hanh. To live or to die is not the question either, and so then what is the question? How do we understand all this? If what we are in the midst of is neither existence nor non-existence, which is what Buddhism posits, then what is it? How is it? And how do I live and die in it? I am the supreme and fiery force who has kindled all sparks of life and breathed forth none of death. And I judge things as they are. Tracing the revolving orbits with wisdom, I have established true order there. I, the fiery life, blaze above the beauty of the fields, shine in the waters, and burn in the sun, moon, and stars. As one of you said, hot damn, Hildegard. Wait to start or end or continue your day. And as I actually went back and read this more closely, she's describing one of her visions, for which she was best known for, probably. I mean, this woman who did everything. Who spoke, I think, like 5 different languages, was a naturalist, doctor, or medical writer, people say. Invented her own language, the lingua ignota, I think she called it, the unknown language, to record her visions. And she has 3 books of her visions, which she said came to her completely unbidden, while awake. You know, they weren't dreams. And at a certain point, she had another vision from God that said, write them down. And so she did. She was already well into her adult years, because she started having these when she was 3. And then she started writing them down. And this one, she's describing kind of what sounds like an angel, because he has wings. And he's the one who is, he or they are the ones who are speaking. They're the supreme and fiery force. But it works just as well for each one of us to claim this. When Thich Nhat Hanh says that to be or not to be is not the question, then he goes on to say, essentially, you know, death is not the end, it's transformation. And if we could remember this, perhaps we would not be so afraid of dying. And often, you know, people will say, rightly so, that they're less afraid of that moment of death than of the dying process. They're afraid of that pain, that dissolution, that change. Understandably. And so you have to inhabit that change completely. Letting each breath be the first and the last, so that there's no burden. What if, I should have, I didn't, one day. And the way this looks, it's not in any way mystical. Well, for some people it is. For Hildegard it was. And in the midst of all that she did, she was founding monasteries. She founded 2. She must have been dealing with her nuns. At a certain point, she probably was dealing with her own breaking down body. And so to breathe each breath as if it's the first and the last is also just to breathe. As you drive to the supermarket, as you feed your cat, as you put on clothes in the morning, wash your face. But doing it in such a way that there is no room for that burden. What if they should have, they didn't, one day? And so to know that we die as we're living, and that we live as we're dying, is to be undone by life in the act of living, and to be unraveled by life in the best possible way. And that is to let the simplest things arrest you. To walk down the street and see a ray of sunlight catching a young girl's hair just so, and she's looking down at a luna moth just landed on her palm. And you see this and your breath catches in your throat and you think, where have I been all this time? Where have I been that I couldn't see? I couldn't feel this miracle. And it's to make a vow that you won't miss this anymore. Not through distraction, not through sorrow, not through blindness, not through fear, because it's too inconceivable. This is inconceivable, and this is inconceivable. And not knowing it, as I often say, doesn't make it any less true. That's the nice thing about reality. Our delusion doesn't actually mar it. It doesn't impede it. It's only in our minds, it's only in the way that we perceive where the impediment happens. This is called Wondrous by Sarah Freeley. I think that's how you say her last name, Freeley. I'm driving home from school when the radio talk turns to Evie White, his birthday, and I exit the here and now of the freeway at rush hour, travel back into the past where my mother is reading to my sister and me, the part about Charlotte laying her eggs and dying. And though this is the 5th time Charlotte has died, my mother is crying again. And we're laughing at her because we know nothing of loss and its sad math, how every subtraction is exponential, how each grief multiplies the one preceding it, how the author tried 17 times to record the words, "She died alone," without crying. 17 takes and a short walk during which he called himself ridiculous. A grown man crying for a spider he'd spun out of the silk thread of invention. Wonders how those words would come back and make him cry. And yes, wonders to hear my mother's voice 10 years after the day she died, the catch, the rasp, the gathering up before she could say to us, "I'm okay." It's a true story that E.B. White couldn't write Charlotte's death, that scene of Charlotte's death, without breaking down himself. And so that he had to, actually, the way that I know the story, now that I remember, is that he was reading the book on the radio, and that every time he got to it, he couldn't read it without crying. And so he tried 17 times, berating himself for his own sadness at the death of this spider that he created. You know, it's also true that Maureen Stewart, who was a Zen teacher, she was active, I think, especially in the 80s, and died around that time. And she was known, she was a little bit like Charlotte Jokubek. She was very direct, very fierce, and very, very no nonsense, and very no frills. And she was dying. She had cancer. And one day she gave a talk and she said very simply, "I'm not sick." And everybody was shocked. They thought, she's lost it. And everybody was talking about it, but no one had the courage to ask her, to say anything. You know how that is. It's like, well, the teacher said it. Who knows what's going on? She's probably not all the way there, but I'm not going to ask her. And finally, somebody was like, I'm going to ask her. And they went up and they're like, "Teacher, what do you actually mean when you say you're not sick?" And she said, "Oh, I know I have cancer. I know it's going to kill me within a year, but I'm not sick. This is just what's happening." Dongshan said that to his assembly when he was dying. And they're carrying on, they're crying. And apparently he got up like from his deathbed and scolded everyone. He's like, "What are you doing? What are you doing?" And he's known for one of his best known koans, they said, find the one. Somebody asks him, "How's your health? How are you doing, teacher?" And he says something like, "There is the one who is not sick." Kurt Vonnegut said, when you die, you'll be dead. Zen says the same thing. I mean, essentially, don't worry about it. Don't worry about living. Don't worry about dying. Just. Which is not nothing by any stretch of the imagination. And all of this to say that we are life entire, every last blessed spark, and all that is rooted in me, is rooted in you. And since all vitality blazes forth from me, I also serve. Yes. Yes.